is a global phenomenon. I think we've had a particular kind of, and I would say unfortunate kind of response to both the pandemic itself and the way that we've coped with it, grappled with it. How would you compare what happened in Japan after 1945 to what has happened in the U.S. after 2020?
Well, as different as they are, there are indeed certain parallels because the bomb left an image in people's minds of a weapon that not only killed at a radically new dimension, was not only destructive in a way that no other weapon, to a degree that no other weapon had been before, but left in your bones a poison which could be undetected and then could strike you down at any time. Right. And that poison was, of course, radiation effects. And COVID-19, the COVID pandemic, is also an invisible process, which people are confused by, but it can suddenly strike one down without, and both, in a sense, were poisons that were everywhere and nowhere and invisible. And of course, with COVID-19, especially long COVID, there is separation from victims, from their families who can't come and be with them. So there are parallels as different as they are. And in both cases, there was extreme psychic numbing, a term I use for a kind of closing down of feelings, so that psychic numbing is a diminished capacity and inclination to feel. And psychic numbing played a very large part. It's my argument in the book that one has to overcome the psychic numbing and confront such catastrophes in order to be able to bring about society's recovery. And that's not a simple process or anything immediate or guaranteed. It's a struggle with a lot of pain, right, but one in which survivors have a very special experience. The survivors, that is, show wisdom, and I can speak of the wisdom of survivors gained through the extent of their suffering and pain. And they then create imagery of transformation from a helpless victim to a life-enhancing survivor. Because, as I make clear in the book, when you're exposed to very extreme trauma, very extreme pain, you have options of either closing down or opening out. It takes people sometimes a long time in both cases to open out, but the opening out is what creates the possibility for survivor wisdom, and that becomes really important. When I interviewed people, both from Hiroshima and from who had been prisoners in Auschwitz, prisoner doctors in Auschwitz, and I asked them about their experience, they would say, I was a different person in Hiroshima, or I was a different person in Auschwitz. You had to some extent, close down and undergo extreme psychic numbing, but there was the possibility subsequently to find meaning in telling the story about what you had been through, in creating a narrative, and that gave significance and meaning to to the story for both people who had been survivors of Auschwitz and survivors of Hiroshima.
I'm interested to find out what you think the additional wrinkle that COVID-19 has had in terms of the necessary isolating that many, both in the United States and throughout the world, have gone through in order to survive and slow the spread of the disease. Because it strikes me that for all the horrors of Hiroshima and the Holocaust, that kind of widespread isolation was not a factor in those disasters, and that would be a difficult complication especially for younger people who had not necessarily formed all of their social bonds in recovering and getting back to a place of, I hesitate to use the word normality, but perhaps at least stasis. How does that additional complicating factor make recovering from COVID perhaps more difficult?
Well, you're very right. It's an additional factor of great importance and furthers that isolating process. But what has also happened with COVID-19 and the COVID pandemic is that groups of survivors who have themselves survived COVID, or their families or people very close to them, have formed survivor groups. They call them COVID widows and widowers, or COVID survival, or long COVID stuff. And they, as survivors, form groups that seek to influence the larger society. That's the immediate experience of COVID, and they're the ones who are affected to the greatest and most searing extent. But the rest of us who try to avoid COVID and frequently move to different places or take steps to avoid it, we are also struggling with death anxiety, because there's anxiety about being subjected to COVID, even though we're at a distance from anyone who's had it. We are more distant survivors of the death anxiety that has been created really all through the world, because COVID pandemic is a planetary experience. Right. And in that sense, there has to be more connection, and that's the effort of the more immediate survivors, more attention to recognizing that all of us, in seeking to avoid COVID, are struggling with death anxiety and struggling to cope with and survive that death anxiety. But that very struggle can help us to confront it and bring more energy to that struggle with death anxiety. And a struggle with death anxiety can ultimately be a source of energy in confronting the source of that death anxiety.
To what degree have you considered or delved into historical or generational recovery? It strikes me that in 2023 there are a lot of places who, for political reasons, the state of Florida comes to my mind, who have limited or circumscribed the study of African American slavery in the United States and the history of that, and we know that this certainly for the people who went through it, who went through the Jim Crow era after slavery was abolished, has created enormous trauma, beyond trauma for generations of people.
Yes,
and that this echoes down the halls of history, and that it impacts people in emotional and traumatic ways to this day. And yet there are some who are dedicated, it seems, to trying to forget that history. Can that trauma ever truly be processed if we cannot even remember and examine what actually took place?
Well, yes, it's almost unbelievable to observe the effort to control reality to the point of saying that slavery was good for you,
right?
Because it might have taught you something or some kind of trade. That's so bizarre, but it's an effort to own reality and control reality. The effort is egregious, but it can never be completely successful. And in terms of that, the Black Power, Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement seeks to contest that falsehood. There is one way to look at it all is that there's no moment in which we achieve a complete and final goal, or what can be called a Sartori moment in this, but it is rather a continuous struggle against falsehood and an effort to call forth our institutions, which are still active, even though they've been battered by the right wingers and white supremacists and Trumpists. The institutions are still functional, as we can see in the work of Jack Smith
Yes.
and in the prosecutions and indictments by Smith and the Georgia prosecutor. They are active in evoking our institutions and in insisting that we behave according to them and according to our traditional institutional emphasis on evidence and truth. And that's what my book seeks to contribute to.
It's fascinating that you bring that up because, it's certainly separate from my original question. I think you have really hit on something in that not only are the prosecutions that we're seeing now part of an important and critical legal process in order to make sure that Trump and his co-conspirators are held to account legally, but it's also part of the psychological healing process for a country which in many ways, because of Trump, has been turned upside down and needs a healing process to right itself from an era of politics and culture which has turned the very idea of truth itself and criminality upside down. And it's something that we need to be able to publicly process in order to heal from that as well.
That's right. We need that, and we need it collectively. And one of the first things that the Biden administration did was to try to hold a national mourning process, which attempted to help Americans in general absorb